Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Nebraska Farm Bureau's Inside Profitability. I'm your host, Austin Arthorn. I'm an economist here at Nebraska Farm Bureau. For those who are new here, Inside Profitability is a video series we put out once a month where we kind of discuss a pressing topic on the minds of our members here in Nebraska, one that can really impact their bottom line. Here today, we're going to be revisiting the H2A program. We discussed this back in, I think, winter of last year. There's some new stuff that we have for you today. In Nebraska, anyone who's had to hire out labor on their ag operation knows good help is hard to find. Not only is there a massive labor shortage across the state and across the nation, being able to find interested and dedicated individuals to want to do the work from that already small pool can seem impossible. The Department of Labor's H2A program, which allows for temporary employment of foreign nationals in ag jobs, has been a great asset for many farms, ranches, and feedlots across the state to help fill that need and fill those labor needs when the local labor force isn't there for that. However, there's been many operations depending on these H2A employees. They may face significant increases in their labor costs because of some new guidelines here. They went into effect this spring, and they may limit some of the producers' ability to leverage the vital H2A program that's been important for a lot of their operations. To walk us through those changes and discuss kind of the impacts on the farm level, we welcome Veronica, Nigh, and Walt Boatright from the American Farm Bureau Federation to our program today. Veronica is a AFBF senior economist, and Walt is director of government affairs there at AFBF. And both of them are wealth of knowledge here. So we're glad that you two are here. I'll let you kind of take it away from here.
Thank you, Austin, and really glad to have the opportunity to join you. I'm going to kick things off, give a little bit of background in terms of the rule that we're talking about today and what AFBF has done to try to have some influence in this conversation. And then I plan to kick it off to Veronica to get into the weeds a little bit in terms of the data and the impacts on the farm. So I'm going to share my screen. Like Austin alluded to, we have been through several rounds of rulemaking with the Department of Labor as it relates to the H2A program. In this particular scenario, we're talking about changes to how they calculate the adverse effect wage rate within the H2A program. This wage rate is the minimum wage rate for H2A guest workers coming in and using the program. And Department of Labor over the past couple of years has proposed a change in how they intend to calculate that for certain job occupations within the H2A program. Just to give you a timeline in terms of how long we've been at this, the Department of Labor proposed a change to this methodology in December of 2021, which gave pretty much the entire industry and certain stakeholders an opportunity to comment on that proposed rule. American Farm Bureau filed comments in opposition to this proposed methodology on January 31st, 2022, towards the tail end of that comment period. Department of Labor took not only our comments, but a host of other comments and considered those, went through them, and finally published a final rule on February 28th, 2023. And that new rule, largely unchanged from the proposed rule in 2021, was announced to be in effect by March 30th, 2023. So now for all H2A program users, you are operating under this new program rule promulgated in late February. What's in the rule? How will this impact farms and ranches across the country who are utilizing that? The essence or the main change that we want to spotlight for you today is that for a certain number of job occupations, 6 in total that you see on the screen, the adverse effect wage rate and how they calculate that wage rate for those job occupations will remain unchanged. The AWR is, as we like to call it, is determined by the Farm Labor Survey administered through the USDA, and it changes on an annual basis by region. That will remain, like I said, unchanged for these 6 job occupations, which include graders and sorters, agricultural equipment operators, farm workers and laborers, nursery and greenhouse workers, packers and packagers, as well as farm workers classified under a farm, ranch, or aquacultural category. However, there will be changes in certain job occupations in terms of the data they use to derive that new wage rate. We're talking about for job occupations like truck drivers, farm supervisors and managers, as well as general construction workers. These new wage rates for these job occupations will be derived from the Occupational Employment and Wage Statistics Survey out of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. In short, after the good work of Veronica and our economics team really delved into that proposed rule and determining how this would impact on-farm realities, the clear analysis shows that there will be a unavoidable increase in labor cost as a result of this rule for the H-2A employer and the family farmer. And Veronica is going to be able to share a lot of those highlights for you shortly. That is the main challenge there, but this rule also presents a host of other challenges that we expect to see as H-2A employers start to utilize the program beyond March 30th. One thing to note is that in terms of the data and the assessment of that data and translating it into an applicable wage rate, the OEWS data is on a different timeline than the typical data that we use to calculate the AWR. That data will be available and applicable in July of every year, whereas the adverse effect wage rate data that we see usually is unveiled in November and usually becomes enforceable on January 1 of each year. So producers and farmers in the countryside are going to have to get used to or learn how to handle two varying wage rates based on the data that is put forward on a twice yearly basis. The other thing that I'll note is that if an H-2A worker in a non-range occupation, which means those occupations that I alluded will be under a separate data set, performs relevant duties for the portion of the contract period, they must be paid that wage rate for the entire contract period, which for a lot of us in the agriculture industry is quite concerning. Many of you know farm workers perform a variety of duties on farm, and it varies in the amount of time commitment they have on any given day. So, for instance, if you expect one of your H-2A workers to drive a truck for maybe a small period of time or to run and haul some product one morning, they're expected to be paid that rate. That truck driver rate derived from the OEWS wage rate for the duration of that contract period. So that is where we're going to see a huge uptick, and you're going to see a huge increase in the wage obligations you have towards H-2A workers. And then the final impact that we generally see from this adverse effect wage rate rule is that the petitioning process for H-2A workers is going to be more administratively burdensome, with multiple petitions having to be filed for the same amount of employees. We're going to see corresponding employment requirements through the petitioning process that is going to cause a lot of H-2A workers and a lot of H-2A employers to recalibrate how they petition the department to be able to really file for the same amount of employees. What has American Farm Bureau been doing in this regard? Clearly, we've known that the department was considering this for a number of years now, really since 2021. But recently, as we've seen this rule come down, we've been at work trying to understand the rule, but also trying to work with our policymakers to ensure that they understand the impacts and can help us find a solution. On March 17th, we saw a bipartisan proposal to freeze the adverse effect wage rate at 2022 levels to stop not only the impacts from the major increases in the 2023 AWR across the board, but also the impacts that this rule will have on farm. On March 30th, Veronica published a market intel explaining the farm impacts that we're seeing, and that has gotten widespread interest and viewership. On April 24th, we saw a lot of industry groups put forward and announce litigation challenging the rules in court due to just the incredibly widespread and far-reaching impact that we're seeing on farm. And on April 25th, we also saw an attempt across both chambers in Congress to introduce a Congressional Review Act resolution of disapproval for this adverse effect wage rate rule, which attempts to nullify or claw back this rule from the Department of Labor. So there has been a lot of interest and a lot of concern as to why and how we can counteract this rule. And those are several of the ways that we hope we can do that and in the short term and in the long term. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Veronica to share with you some of the challenges and some of the data.
Well, thanks, John, Walt, and thanks, Austin and Nebraska Farm Bureau, for your interest in this issue. It's obviously very important. I think we can, as we look at this new rule, we can sort out sort of the known unknowns versus the unknown unknowns. And so I'll start here in that when DOL put forward this new methodology, they said only about 2% of positions they thought would fall outside of that 6 SOC sort of traditional AWR wage rate. They did that by looking through the fiscal year 22 certified positions data that they had. And we have some issues with that, right? Those SOC codes were assigned to positions before, frankly, it really mattered, right? Because everyone was paid the same wage rate, irrespective of what SOC code a particular position was assigned. So following that methodology doesn't make a lot of sense for assigning to say only 2% of positions would be certified positions would be impacted. But if we're going along with that, just for the sake of argumentation, I'll note that in Nebraska, you all had 3,358 certified H-2A positions in fiscal year 22. It's worth noting that that was an increase of 37% over fiscal year 21. So huge increases in states that we don't necessarily traditionally associate with the H-2A program, which is certainly something that needs to be made more known across legislators of all states. And going along with DOL's flawed methodology, when I look through your certified positions, I see that last year, 14% of your positions, or 473 positions, had SOC codes outside of that 6 that will have that the same AWR methodology as before. Of those 473 positions, these are the SOC codes that were assigned to positions in Nebraska in fiscal year 22. There we go. So kind of splitting that now into the known unknowns. So we know, right, because they've already been identified by a defined SOC code that's outside of those 6, we know what those operations would have to pay those positions that are that were classified by those SOC codes. So I'll start with, in calendar year 22, the Nebraska AWR was 1647. In calendar year 23, 1733. John Walt noted that there's going to be 2 different periods now for the time when employers have to update wages. So that it's relevant to look at it and say, well, in the May 21 OEWS data, which would apply to wages paid between July 1, 22 and June 30, 2023, for those SOCs that were already identified in the fiscal year 22 position data, we can see what folks would have had to been paying workers. So, for example, 119013 farmers, ranchers, and other agricultural managers, $33.78, which is obviously a huge increase over the traditional AWR. And you can read through there and see that there's a huge variety of wage rates. One thing I will note, though, is I have highlighted in red the helpers carpenters SOC code, which is 473012, which had, according to OEWS, a wage rate of $15.18. Why does that matter? It's because as an employer, you're not going to get to pay $15.18 because the H-2A rule dictates that you have to pay the highest wage available. So it's only upside, it's only downside for operators. So if you're hiring folks who are in that helpers carpenters SOC code, and you're thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm gonna get to, the wage rate that I'm paying is a little bit less than the 6-digit or 6-code SOC, AWR above. Think again, you have to pay the higher of those two wage rates. And then just today, this morning at 10 o'clock, BLS released new data for the May 2022 OEWS. So these wage rates are the ones that would apply from July 1, 2023 through June 30, 2024. And you'll see that, for some positions, there wasn't a huge amount of change, right? Those farmers, ranchers, and other ag managers are still particularly high. In fact, it actually went down 50 cents per hour from 33.78 to 33.28. But certainly wasn't the case for everybody. So if I'll draw your attention to 53.30.32, heavy and tractor trailer truck drivers, which went up almost $5 from $25.59 to $30.56. So a lot of those wage rates are obviously quite a lot higher than the known AWR. But at least those are the unknowns we know now, right? Moving into the unknown unknowns, and this is where things get really complicated. I'll remind you again that Nebraska had 3,358 certified positions in fiscal year 22. Of those, 1,006 of those positions had the SOC code of ag equipment operator, which is within the 6 SOC single AWR grouping. But I'd pose a couple of questions in that. And one is, how many growers consider driving a truck, either light or heavy duty, to be part of the job of an ag equipment operator? So as DOL, as the state employment office is starting to look at these applications with a different lens, how many of those jobs will no longer be classified as ag equipment operators, but rather something else? And those that I think that are more likely to be classified as something else are those for positions that have job titles that maybe suggest that other work is being performed. So of those a little over 1,000 positions, here's like 4 different ones that sort of jumped out at me. Because the job title is what the applicant puts on the application is what the position will be. So general farm worker / grain hauler. Grain hauler sounds a lot like somebody who might be operating a truck and therefore may no longer be classified as an ag equipment operator, but rather a truck driver. Farm operations assistant, that sounds very managerial to me. Farm equipment mechanic also does not necessarily pass the sniff test for ag equipment operator if you're looking at it through the lens of DOL. So kind of looking through that again, I'll remind you those ag equipment operator position titles that I think would be ripe for reclassification: general farm worker, operations assistant, equipment mechanic, grain hauler. And then again, the calendar year 22 and calendar year 23 AWRs. And then maybe some options for how DOL might reclassify those positions. So for the general farm worker, that seems like probably, I would have to look at the application, of course, and get a full description of the work to be performed, but it seems likely that might fall within that 6 SOC code, and therefore they would be paid just the regular AWR. But then we move into this farm operations assistant. kind of depends on who's reviewing the application for how they might think that what work was being completed. So, maybe an option for that would be, I don't know, 1190.13, the ag managers, which was in the May 21 OEWS was $33.78. Or maybe someone who is reviewing the application says, no, based on the description, that looks a lot more like a business operations specialist to me. And the wage rate for that's $34.76. Okay, so then moving on to farm equipment mechanic. That one last year was $22.72. And then how about this farm worker grain hauler? Well, sort of depends on what kind of work they're doing. So if they're the final rule was delightfully specifically vague as far as looking at some of these descriptions, and they said, well, if they're just driving on farm roads but not on the open road, well, then that might be farm work. Well, if they're just driving a light truck, that's one thing. And if they're doing it on, so if they're driving a light truck on farm roads, no problem. If they're driving a light truck on public roads, well, then you have to pay them as a light truck driver. That's the 53.30.33. But if it's not considered a light truck, but maybe a tractor trailer, I don't know how most people haul grain. Well, that's a different SOC. That's 53.30.32. And last year that wage rate was $25.59. All right. Well, what if actually what they're doing is they're hauling grain only on farm roads, only in a light truck for practical considerations, but they're also driving the work van from the housing to the work site. Well, then they're a shuttle driver and a chauffeur. Okay, so in Nebraska, the wage rate that was just released today for a shuttle driver and a chauffeur was $15.43. All right. Well, that you don't get to avail yourself of that lower wage rate. That just means that you have to pay that 6 SOC sort of general A work. What we see as we go through the data is, of course, that state by state, there's a huge amount of variation. So in the state of New York, the shuttle drivers and chauffeurs average wage rate's like $20. So for that really small portion of the workday that someone is moving workers from housing to the field, that means that for the entirety of their contract, they have to be paid at that higher wage rate. So this unknown is really dependent on what reviewer you get, how you describe the work, and sort of just the general mood that DOL finds themselves in the day they're reviewing the work. So as we sort of looked at this and said, all right, let's do some representative farms. Let's say, what does the H2A, what would the wage outlays be for a small farm versus a large farm under the 2023 final rule versus the current stat, before the implementation of that final rule? Small farm being defined as a farm with 10 H2A employees and a large farm being defined as a farm with 70 H2A employees. And it's not surprising that small farms have a higher increase in wage rates. Obviously, if you only have 10 employees and one of those employees goes from being paid the general H2A wage rate now to a managerial level because they're supervising the other 9 people, you have fewer employees to spread that increased wage across, and therefore your wage rate increase is larger. But certainly large farms are not without impact. So, as you look across this 6-year data stream, an average increase of 5.5% to 6% for large farms, and somewhere between 12 and about 14% for small farms. Looking at Nebraska specifically, this is just reflecting basically that obviously there's a lot of wage discrepancy across different regions of the United States. Nebraska finds itself in the Northern Plains region, which I have highlighted with that black arrow, but you'll see that, relative to other regions of the country, we think that while you will certainly see an increase on your operations, maybe not as much as maybe the Delta or the Southeast. Same thing for large farms. Nebraska, the region of Northern Plains is likely to see a slightly smaller increase in overall wage outlays relative to some of the other regions, but it's certainly not insignificant. But what I will stop to point out here and wrap up with is, I'll remind you that DOL said only 2% of positions they thought would find themselves in this situation where they would be paying individual SOC wage rates. But when you look at the Farm Labor Survey, which John Walt mentioned earlier, their estimate is about 10% of positions lie outside of that 6H or SOC code definition. And I already mentioned that when I went through the 2022 data for Nebraska, without even reclassifying potentially some of those farm equipment operators, Nebraska has 14% of positions that fall outside of that sort of large grouping. So there's certainly going to be a huge amount of variation from state to state based on how many positions end up getting reclassified from this general AWR to an individual position type of AWR. And that wraps up for me. Look forward to any questions you have, Austin.
Yeah, thanks you too, Veronica and John Walt. That's awesome. Yeah, I guess my first question, I guess I'd like to understand OEWS better, those rates that are outside of those 6 core positions, I guess, wage to pay. Could you talk about how those are found, what they're based off of, if it's a national rate, and if it's tied at all down to like the state level?
Yeah, good question. I'll take the first crack at that. So OEWS is a survey that's conducted of individual businesses by the state workforce agency. It is a robust survey. It's done across all states and all sizes of employers. So it's a very large data set. It comes out once a year. So you notice that the data they just released today is for fiscal year 22. So you're kind of at almost a year delay on that compilation of that data. What I will note, and I'm glad that you mentioned this, is that the AWR, the new rule, does stipulate that if a state level data for a data does not exist for a particular SOC, then it goes to a federal rate, so a national average wage rate. So and on a couple of my slides, you noted that after the wage rate, it said NE after it, and that's denoting that those wages were Nebraska state level wages. That's because Nebraska has a fantastic, robust workforce and a wide variety of different occupations. Not every state is in the same position. And so those states that have what we would consider thin data for particular positions will find that they're using a national wage rate more often than say we saw for that small sampling for Nebraska.
Gotcha. And that's exactly what I was getting to. I saw the NE in parentheses and I had read your article on it. And yeah, there's a lot of concern about these rates coming from a national data set rather than local factors here in Nebraska. If they come from a national data set, you'd like to, or I think it'd be safe to assume they'd be a higher rate, more expensive for farmers and ranchers here in the state. So that's a definite concern.
Yeah, generally the further away you get from local data, the more variety and variation you would see. So yeah, we have concerns about that as well.
So John Walt, you mentioned, sorry, let me slow down. John Walt, you mentioned there's some recent litigation challenging this rule and a congressional disapproval of this rule. Is any of that going to slow down or stall any of this coming to fruition for the time being?
Austin, appreciate the question. Unfortunately, no. This rule is in effect as of March 30th. Farms who utilize the H-2A program are going to see these impacts in contracts starting on March 30th and beyond, and certainly we'll start to see impacts from these new job occupation or SOC code rates starting in July. So I mean, it's there's not a whole lot we can do in the short term, but what we are doing is we're communicating very clearly to policymakers, and they've heard us on this, which is why we've seen the CRA effort underway. There are some industry groups, like I said, some in the ag sphere who want to try to see if the courts would be interested in intervening. So we're hopeful that that is successful. We've also, something that I don't think I mentioned in my slide was that we've also published an action alert through AFBF and circulated it to the state. So for folks who are out there and wanting to weigh in with their policymaker to try to encourage them to take action sooner rather than later, we're encouraging folks to weigh in through that platform to be able to share those.
Is that the way you'd recommend some of our members and farmers ranchers to get involved? Is there any other ways they can have a stake in this issue or anything else they can do? It's a lot. I mean, I know it's probably a bigger issue on the coast with people who use H2A workers and like orchard stuff, but here in Nebraska, they're used in feedlots and on copper operations, and it has a huge impact here too. Is there anything that they can do? Anything else they can do? I guess
the number one way that you can help move this issue for some action in the future is to try to get in touch with your member of Congress and encourage them. As we've stated, we've weighed in with the Department of Labor. We've provided analysis data, insight as to how this would affect, family farms and H2A users. They decide to move forward with the rule anyways, despite those impacts. So now what we're trying to do is work with everybody out in the countryside to communicate with their member of Congress. One way to do that is through the action alert. Another way is if folks have relationships or if folks can communicate with those congressional offices, whether in district or in Washington, D.C., we would encourage that and welcome that.
Is AF proposing any specific alternate rule to this rule, or what? I guess if you can speak to it, what would be the ideal situation in AFBF's mind for something like this?
Well, we'd love to see the rule rescinded. That would be a nice way to start. But we also understand that we've had, that would only get us back to where we were prior to the rule's implementation. We've been longtime critics of the adverse effect wage rate itself and how it's calculated, the methodology it's used. Department of Labor, at least for certain job occupations, have decided to move forward with a new methodology that actually makes it worse in terms of on-farm impacts. So we are in ongoing conversations with members of Congress, folks who are interested in this issue, as to how do we improve and what alternatives are out there. So we're in process of having those conversations, and we're hopeful that maybe we can come up with some proposals that'll be helpful moving forward.
Perfect. Is there anything else you two would like to add? Anything else you two would like to revocalize, or some main takeaways here?
I would just highlight that one of the things that stands out to me in this particularly bad rule is the uncertainty that that it's going to place on folks who actually utilize the program. So, I mean, we've all been to football games where the refs are just not great, right? And they make weird calls, and the outcome of the game, you're like, if it had just been somebody else, they would have seen that play differently, and the outcome of the game could have been completely different. Now we're doing that with people's businesses. So when someone is going through the application, different reviewers hone in on different words, and you could see two similar applications from two very similar operations have very different wage rate outlays because of the way they're being classified. So for when folks are reaching out to their elected officials, just I would certainly highlight how much limbo that puts our businesses in, that we can't really plan very far in advance. At least, unfortunately, with the old way of doing things, even when the AWR went up significantly, we knew it was going to change once, right? Once per year. Now we're looking at 2 times per year, and how those positions might be certified might change every year depending on the mood of the person reviewing it. And even if you have a good relationship, even if you have a strong the Nebraska folks who are reviewing the applications have a really strong understanding of how the position might be, what the work the person might be doing, it's subject to secondary review by DOL. And so they can certainly change that. And so that really stands out to me when we're thinking about the impact this could potentially have. Is, 2 operations very similar could have very different outcomes based on really not facts, but the lens under which the reviewer is reviewing their application.
And just to piggyback off Veronica's comments, I mean, the volatility we see in this, the uncertainty we see, on top of the adverse regulatory environment where we're continuing to see challenges in other areas on farm, following high input costs, following supply chain volatility. This is going to cause farmers across the country who have relied on the H-2A program to reconsider how they need to restructure, or if they need to make other decisions about whether or not to continue on farm. And there's been more than one analogy or more than one acknowledgement that this down the road could ultimately lead to more imported products coming from other countries and fewer and less domestic production. So we really have to take that into consideration when we start thinking about how our own government is making things harder for us to produce a safe and abundant food supply.
Gosh, that's a great point. Thank you too. Yeah, I guess I'll wrap this up here. Thank you so much, Veronica and John Walt, for joining us today. Great insights here for sure, and a lot for our producers here to think about when thinking about using H2A and going forward. A lot of, like you said, Veronica, uncertainties. So for anyone with questions, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm sure these 2 are willing to speak to those. Otherwise, you know where to reach me. Other than that, thanks for tuning in today. As always, if you'd like to see something specific discussed in the series, you can go ahead and shoot me an email, austinh@nefb.org. And then a reminder that the entire Inside Profitability series is on our YouTube page, Nebraska Farm Bureau YouTube page. With that, I think that's a wrap. Thanks again, Veronica, John Walt. I hope everyone else has a great rest of your day.